Greetings, everyone. I'm Scott Rodell here at the Great River Taoist Center, which of course is also home to our Academy of Chinese Swordsmanship. In this episode of Chinese Swords and Swordsmanship, I'm going to be doing a couple of things quite different. And that is, I'm not going to be talking about a Chinese sword. You might think I'm going to be talking about Japanese swords. This sword is, in fact, the saber is Korean. And I'm going to do something else I don't usually do, which is to talk about a sword that I really don't know a lot about. I've been researching it, looking into it, and I'm going to share my thoughts and ideas with you. And I hope that there are lots of people out there who know more about Korean swords than I do, have other ideas, and that you'll share them in the comments. So please, hope you'll watch to the end. And when you do, write in your comments. Give me your ideas. If you've got more information about Korean swords, please share that so I can learn and everybody else can. And I'm going to be reading all those comments and doing my best to answer and reply as I can. This sword we know dates from the 19th century, maybe the earliest 20th century, around that kind of period. The 19th century was a very difficult time for Korea. They were positioned between the Qing dragon and the Japanese tiger. Internally, they were racked with rebellions, there were peasant revolts, there were coup attempts, so it was a very difficult time in Korea. Finally, in 1897, the King Gojong, forgive me, I don't pronounce his name quite correctly, yielded to these pressures and broke with the centuries of Korea being a vassal state of China, ended Korea's subjugation to the Qing, and declared an empire. So created the first Korean empire that lasted from 1879 to 1910. One of the things that the now emperor did was work to modernize the Korean military. No doubt he saw how things changed for Japan, how under the Meiji they reformed their military, how they adopted European weapons, and how strong that made Japan in comparison to China. So no doubt he was thinking about that when he wanted to strengthen his empire, to strengthen his role as emperor, he needed to modernize his military. And so what has that got to do with this Korean saber? Well, first let's take a look at it. The scabbard is a replacement, so I'm going to draw that and just set that aside. Okay. So first thing, let's take a quick look at the stats. It's 76 centimeters long. That's 30 inches. So a little bit on the long side for a lot of, say, Chinese swords of similar period, but not particularly long. It has a grip length of 20 centimeters. That's 8 inches, actually just a tad over 20 centimeters. And it's a bit hefty blade. It's 934 grams. That's just an ounce over 2 pounds. It's got a little bit more weight than, say, a typical dowel might be, especially a later one. But I can still wield it if I want to cut with it and move with it in a very Chinese saber sort of fashion, or in a Jin sort of fashion, Jianfa. I can wield it just fine with one hand. It sometimes feel just a tad heavy, but it works well. However, as soon as you take it with two hands and use this more and more the fashion that Korean swords were being used during that period, and a little bit more the way Japanese swords tended to be with a longer grip and a two-handed grip on the hilt, it really feels much more lively that way. So I think this sword was probably meant and created to be used for a two-handed sort of grip. If we take a closer look at the sword itself, the first thing is that, although I know it's from Korea, it really is not like any other Korean traditional swords. If you look at swords from a little bit previous to this one, we know that it's not at all like Korean swords. This blade form is not Korean at all. If I look closely at the blade, and obviously something that doesn't come across well on screen, it's in a very nice, good polish, but with the naked eye and the right light, I can see very clearly this is a very nice pattern welded blade. And in fact, it's forged so that it has what's called, in Chinese we call qiangan, an inserted hardened edge. And this blade is made in a very typical Qing sort of, or Chinese sort of forging method. So the blade, although it's clearly not a Chinese form, clearly not a Korean form, is made in a typical fashion that was in China and also in use in Korea at the time. If we look at the fittings, these heavy brass fittings, you can see how these fittings really are obviously very clearly inspired by Japanese. If we look at the guard, this is clearly just like a Japanese tsuba with the two holes. Unfortunately, as I said, the scabbard's a replacement, so we don't know if it had the two utility knives that you can sometimes find on Japanese swords, but it's certainly clearly imitating a Japanese tsuba. And likewise, the fittings, these brass fittings, are somewhat reminiscent, seem to really have been influenced by Japanese military swords of the period of the late 19th, early 20th century. One other feature that is clearly adopted from Japanese military swords is the scabbard release here. There's a little button here. You press that button, and when it was in its original scabbard, there was a little pin there that would click on and hold it into the scabbard. And so to draw your sword, you'd have to press that and draw it down. Now that's the way the Japanese did it during that period. Earlier Korean swords had a release on the top. So it's another feature that's clearly not of Korean origin, but inspired by the Japanese. So, but the real big mystery is this blade form. And when I looked at this, I thought I really had trouble making heads or tails of it. And I thought, well, it is somewhat reminiscent of the zukuri type sword, a Japanese sword from the 10th century. I think it was used up until the 12th century. Again, if people know more about the zukuri, please comment. Love to hear what you have to say about it. That sword had a very long, sharpened back edge, so it was double-edged for most of its length. So this looks a little bit like that in the sense that, okay, it's double-edged here, but it's still not really quite like that earlier Japanese blade. And also, it brought up the question, well, if that's a 10th century style, would a man at the very beginning of the 20th century, somebody who was undoubtedly an officer in this new Korean Imperial Army, would he have known about that? I mean, it's not like today. We have very free-flowing information. You can get online and look up that name of that sword and see all kinds of pictures and different variants of it. He wouldn't have had that. So possibly he did. He's a military man. Maybe he did know about that very early style of sword. But then why would he want that in the 20th century, right? This is a sword from centuries earlier. That didn't quite make sense. So that didn't seem to be where this blade was inspired by. So I thought about it some more, and I thought, context. Context is everything. So when you think about the context, this was a time when the emperor was bringing in Russian advisors, bringing in European weapons, modern weapons, to strengthen his army, to modernize his army. Wouldn't they have also seen European sabers? And I said, that was the aha moment. And I realized, yes, indeed. If you look at European sabers from about 1820 onwards, up to the very beginning, say, of the 20th century, you see a fair number that are gently curved, as this sword is, and are double-tipped, double-edged here up at this last, about 20% of the blade. So I said, yeah, this is clearly inspired by a European blade. And particularly, if you look at the British 1845 pattern, you'll see that it's almost identical to this. Or I shouldn't say identical, it's very, very close. There are some differences I'll point out in a moment. But as far as it being gently curved, single-edged, and then double-edged toward the tip here, it's the same sort of thing. And there was even Japanese naval sword that is essentially a copy of that British 1845 pattern. So, okay, that makes sense. It fits in context. You have a period where a Korean officer, obviously somebody of means, because this would be an inexpensive sword, this is a very well-made blade, somebody of means, adopting something at the same time that Western military equipment, rifles, machine guns, things like that are coming into Korea to modernize the military. He's going to see this blade form, maybe be taken with it, maybe just want to imitate it, to feel that he's also modernizing and he's going along with its modernization, but it's in some ways quite different. And I have an example. Let me just, for a quick comparison here, have an example of a British saber, and you can see that it has, it's actually even a little bit longer than this Korean one, just an inch or so longer. And you can see this is a pipe back saber, so it's very flexible compared to this one. It will not flex like that, but it has got that same gentle curvature, and it is double-edged up here at the tip. So you can really see, this style of saber was probably what inspired this later Korean saber. One very obvious difference is that this saber, and I'm not trained in British swordsmanship, so forgive my poor handling of the sword. This one is obviously meant for single-handed use. In fact, I'm not even gripping it properly, right? And it's much lighter. It's a lighter, faster sword. So although we compare the blades, you can see, yeah, I can see now where the Koreans probably got this from, or at least this man got his inspiration from, but they are still also quite different. And so I think what's happened here, let me set this down for a moment, is that what we have is a sort of mixed salad hybrid, if you will. We have a blade that's forged in the traditional fashion, the way blades were also forged in China, pattern welded body, you could say, the jackets of the sword with that inserted hard edge. We have these Japanese-inspired fittings, which are very solid. Remember, Japan is a really up-and-coming power during this period. They've really gotten strong during the Meiji, and this is very similar in many ways to those Japanese swords, to those Japanese military swords of the period of the late 19th, early 20th century. I would say that form-wise, it's similar. We have a sword that blade-wise really looks like, yeah, that's inspired by those British, French, other European-style swords that were popular during the period, that they might have seen as Western powers, Western officers, European officers were in Asia, that they might have even seen with their instructors. So you can see that blade form, but it maintains the same sort of weight and balance and handling that Korean swordsmen would have been used to. So it's, come up with this term, I say it is this mixed salad hybrid of traditional forging techniques, modern Asian, Japanese military fittings, and a completely European sort of form to the blade. So that's my thoughts. Who knows if I'm right or wrong? It's very hard to say for sure on something like this, but I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say. If you disagree with me, you agree with me, you agree with me in part, please put it in the comments. I'm very anxious to hear what other people have to say, and I'm really hoping to learn more about Korean swords. So, if you would, please give us that thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, thanks and 再见.